Two neurons communicate through a process called action potential, which is caused from a change of electrical potential by passing an impulse. This is the spark which starts communication. There is a synapse space between two neurons. The action potential cannot jump across the synaptic space. The signal is in the axon terminal before it moves to another neuron. Calcium channels are blocked when they are at a resting position. There is no signals. However, when action potential meets the calcium channels, they open and calcium comes into the neuron terminals, causing the vesicles to begin their movement. The vesicles move toward the end, and the membranes from the vesicles and the axon terminal fuse, making it able for the vesicles to release the molecules, which are the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters move across the synaptic space and bind to the receptors, a special protein which is located on the postsynaptic neuron. After the action potential signal is started on the postsynaptic neuron, so the second neuron that's now getting the signal, the neurotransmitter is then released into the synaptic space once the signal has been started. Some neurotransmitters are degraded by enzymes, and others go back into the presynaptic neuron through transporter proteins, where they are then moved into the presynaptic neuron and packaged back into vesicles to prepare for the next process of action potential. This cycle continues to repeat.
The first stage of action potential is depolarization. During this stage, the sodium channels begin to open and the sodium ions begin to travel through the channels. This causes the RMP to increase. The next stage of action potential is repolarization. During this stage, the potassium channels begin to open and the potassium moves through it. The final stage of action potential is hyperpolarization. This is when the potassium channels start to close, but they don't close in time, so potassium ions travel into the membrane, and this causes an influx of potassium, which causes the RMP to become more negative, going below the RMP rate. Going into more detail, during depolarization, the voltage of the cell goes up to plus 40 nV before the sodium channels start to inactivate by themselves and eventually close at this point. This is where we begin to move into repolarization. When the sodium channels close, the potassium channels begin to open. This allows for the potassium ions to travel through the cell, causing the cell's voltage to fall and decrease the membrane's potential, bringing it down to the RMP. The voltage-gated potassium channels usually stay open past RMP, which causes the cell to move into hyperpolarization for a short time, which is more negative than the RMP. Once the potassium channels close, it allows for the membrane to stabilize and return to RMP, which allows for the process to begin again. Synapses are a gap in which neurons send and receive information to one another. In order to do this, it requires the work of presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. The presynaptic neurons are the sending neurons and launch an action potential in the sending neuron, which allows for the communication of a signal with the postsynaptic receiving neurons that cause it to be more or less inclined to send an action potential back out to the sending neuron. There are two types of synaptic transmissions that can take place. The first and most common is a chemical, and the second is an electrical. The chemical one is more common and allows for transmissions to happen faster. The neurotransmitters are responsible for taking information from presynaptic cells and carrying them to postsynaptic cells, where the information is received. In the electronic transmission, there is an actual connection between the presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. Electronic transmissions take place in the gap junction, which allows for cells to flow from one cell to the next directly.
This is one neuron, and here are its parts broken down. The dendrites are a branch-like area of the neuron where neurotransmitters are received to spark the action potential in the nerve cell. The dendrites have muscles known as protein receptors that receive the signals and start the movement of the signal throughout the neuron. The branch shape is necessary in order for the dendrites to get the information from the largest area. Next is the cell body. which is also known as the soma. It is the control center of the neuron. It produces the energy needed to shoot the signal all the way from the dendrites to the axon to the synapse. There are many organelles that are located inside the cell body, a main one being the nucleus, which contains the DNA of the neuron. There's also the cell membrane, which does the protection and determines what comes in and out of the cell. The axon is a large section of the neuron, which serves as the main conducting unit in which it receives and conveys electrical signals long distances. Axon links can vary in size, from small to short to small to long, depending on what size the neuron is. The dysfunction in the axon can cause neurological disorders. They are different than dendrites because the dendrites receive the signals while the axon transmits them. Around the axon is the myelin sheath, which we see here as represented in the orange beads. The myelin sheath, where it's broken, is called the node of Ranvier. So in here, it would be the purple in between the big sections of the myelin sheath. The myelin helps speed up electrical impulses across an ion, as Jenna said earlier, and the spaces called the nodes of Ranvier keep the ions diffusing in and out, keeping the signal jumping through oscillatory conduction. Then finally, as we've talked about before, the synapse is the gap which enables the signal to be passed to the next neuron, the dendrite of the next neuron. The neuromuscular junction is the synapse between the motor neuron and a muscle.
There are myelinated and unmyelinated axons. Myelinated axons have sheaths which allow for faster conduction speeds because the sheaths act as insulators. Most neurons in the parietal and central nervous system are myelinated because they require a fast conduction speed to relay information quickly. Myelinated axons also have faster impulses. Unmyelinated axons have no sheaths, which cause slower conduction speed because unmyelinated axons do not have the insulators. A similarity that both myelinated and unmyelinated axons share is that they convey electronic signals.
The neurons which connect muscle cells to neurons are called motor neurons. Neurotransmitters are sent from the neurons across the synapse and received at the motor end plate. So from here, it would go to the dendrite of a muscle cell instead of another neuron. When this action potential happens, instead of going from neuron to neuron, it does go from neuron to muscle cell. And as we know, there's 3 types of muscles: smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. And since skeletal muscles are striated, they respond with nerve fibers. So in this example, they would be unmyelinated instead of the myelated sheaths, which we've seen here. Also, when electrical signals in the muscles cause muscles to have movement and contract, so without action potential, we could not move. All this is saying is from here, this neuron, to get it to a muscle cell, instead of just going from a neuron to a neuron, it will go from a neuron to a muscle cell. So it's able to contract and move.